Go ahead, Shravan.
Good morning and welcome to KRVIA Encounters. Arijit Sen is an associate professor of architecture and urban studies at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. He is an architect and vernacular architecture historian who writes, teaches, and studies urban cultural landscapes, immigrant histories, urban history, and community engaged design. In 2008, he co-founded Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures, an interdisciplinary doctoral program area shared by the University of Wisconsin-Madison and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He has served on the boards of Vernacular Architecture Forum and the Society of Architectural Historians since 2012. Sen has continuously directed the Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures Field School, a multidisciplinary project where students, faculty, scholars, and community members explore ways to see and interpret their city by engaging in storytelling, ecological conservation, heritage preservation, and civic engagement. In 2021, Sen began serving as a co-director for the Wisconsin Humanities Community Powered initiative, a public humanities project that builds resilience among Wisconsin communities by helping them recognize, communicate, and act upon their strengths, their challenges, and their histories to envision a bright, vibrant future. His writings include articles and book chapters on South Asian immigrant cultural landscapes, urbanism, and architectural fieldwork. He has co-edited Landscapes of Mobility, Culture, Politics, and Placemaking, and Making Place, Space and Embodiment of the City. Arijit, welcome to KRVIA.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So, and then when I talk, I'll probably go off the screen if you don't mind. Okay, so here we go. All right, so thank you so much. I really will like to thank Professor Patwardhan for inviting me and for everyone who's turned up this early in the morning. It's actually late night for me, so it's good, but I'm really excited that you're awake and here. It's an honor and pleasure to speak at USM's Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environmental Studies, although I'm a little sad it's virtual. Before I begin, I want to remind you that our very presence on any land is a privilege that we should acknowledge and reflect on. The land from where I'm speaking from had once been forcibly taken from the Odawa, Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. They are the original nations of United States, what's now known as the United States. Then later, Black and brown residents were racially segregated and exploited for simply the color of their skin. These people, however, still flourish. They were not defeated. Their presence tells us a story of the human spirit to survive and the human urge to fight injustice. I urge all of you to join me in examining how the land and property you stand in Mumbai are also not neutral territories. That your sheer presence on the land you occupy holds testimony to a past and present history of violence, injustice, and displacement. While we may not change the realities of our history, our silence, our refusal to critically evaluate ourselves, our places, our actions in the present help perpetuate injustice. So why do I begin with violence and injustice? It has to do with who I am. I'm an architect without a center, a person without a place I call home. I grew up in 6 cities and 5 states in India, 4 cities in the United States, always an outsider every time I moved. Now I'm an American citizen, but my diasporic and racial otherness adds to my lack of belonging in one place or a single culture. This experience of not being part of the majority underpins my research interests around meanings and representation of space and place. My own history encourages me to examine how I can tell stories of those who live on the margins, Many of you may not have experienced what it means to be a minority or to be marginalized. Many of you may have that experience. I invite you today to consider what it is to occupy the margins. While architecture is about genus loci, a distinctive sense of place that is unique, permanent, geographically centered, my own sense of place is inflected by my travels. They are multi-perspectival, they are mutable, and they're often disjointed. What happens then if you're not centered in one single place, a single city, a single culture, a single value, or a single nation? It forces us to re-examine architecture in ways different from how we experience it in our classrooms or how we practice it in our offices. For me, such architecture is mobile. It is a sensory, bodily experience that I carry with me, remember, selectively retrieve from memory, and deploy in difficult situations to make sense of the world around me. Architecture is political, it's contested, it's unstable, and it's emergent. So therein lies my first proposition. Architecture is neither an objective reality nor a permanent object. Its form, meaning, and performance depends on the viewer and her perspective. Dancers name this condition as counterpoint, a viscerally and constantly changing entanglement between the material world, humans and non-human bodies, time, and other societal forces. Physical locations that I study are not inert containers where life's drama unfolds. Rather, architecture is an active participant in this contrapuntal movement. In my edited volume titled Making Place, I use the term embodied placemaking to describe how urban places are products of such entanglements. My work explores ways of seeing, interpreting, and acting in such worlds. That world, when occupied by marginalized and minoritized, may indeed be a world marked by injustice and inequalities, but they're also sites of deeply held values, everyday grassroots resistance against power, and utopian dreams for a better future. They are sites that also give birth to visionary cultural change. That is why, as an architectural and urban historian, I focus my research on urban microhistories of marginalized places that are often ignored by experts. In 1850, transcendental philosopher Henry David Thoreau wrote that our perception of beauty is a moral test. Thoreau was not referring to a singular concept of beauty. He was referring to a perspective, a position, and a point of view from which beauty is perceived, so that how we discern beauty becomes our choice. It's our moral choice. As architects, we are often called upon to describe why a certain building or landscape matters, to evaluate its value. Our judgment depends on our economic, personal, ecological, or ideological agendas. Worth and significance of a building remains politically fraught terms. Aesthetics and beauty become contested terrains. Thoreau's quote centers our professional judgment within a moral compass. This quote has implications for our methods of interpreting and documenting the physical world. As a scholar of urban landscapes, I too confront this dilemma whenever I read an urban landscape. I'm left with these questions: whose histories, whose landscapes, and whose values am I validating? While studying the architectural heritage of marginalized communities in Milwaukee, the city I live in, I found that we, that is architects, historians, and scholars, are deeply complicit in the ways injustice is concealed within urban spaces, because the ways we see, document, evaluate, and reproduce buildings, that is our methods of analysis and practice, have literally become modes of concealment, preventing us from noticing alternative histories. So at the very onset, let me offer you 3 axioms that frame my work. 1, change your ways of seeing. As architects and architectural historians, we regularly evaluate architecture with criteria of significance and integrity. We must change our ways of seeing and learn to perceive alternative forms of value, significance, and aesthetics. 2, devise new ways to analyze and document the built environment. Style, materials, and quality of constructions are all evaluated visually or by examining their material conditions. We have to find new ways to analyze the built environment. So what if, borrowing from the Borough Charter from Australia or the UNESCO Intangible Heritage Convention, we focus on cultural practices, bodily performances, ephemeral sensory characters, and affective categories such as intimacy and care when we interpret value in the built environment. And finally, change your methods of data collection. And in order to achieve the goals listed above, the first and second goal, we need to deploy new strategies of data collection that involve those very people who live in the spaces we study. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories to expand on these 3 points. But before I begin my story, here's a little bit more about the setting and context where I come from. As a newcomer to Milwaukee, my first impression of the city came from a tourist map. This map articulated a racialized and segregated geography that I would then encounter. During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, this once industrial metropolis, located on the shore of Lake Michigan, saw difficult times when factories and jobs left the city. Since then, Milwaukee has tried to redefine itself as a successful entrepreneurial and resurgent metropolis by promoting a creative economy, knowledge and information technologies, high-end healthcare, and cultural industries. The city's rebranded tourist map is also color-coded. It identifies a variety of historic neighborhoods and lists a series of retail, commercial, cultural, and historic sites as tourist destinations. But take a closer look, and you find a large section of this map remains unmarked, a gray expanse set in stark contrast to the colorful patchwork. I call these flatlands, or geographies that have been flattened of social, cultural, economic, or historical values. Many Milwaukeeans tend to drive past them quickly, clutch their purse a little closer to their body if they must go there. Prospective homebuyers don't search in these neighborhoods, fearing low real estate values. Yet, as Saskia Sassen argues, flatlands are not isolated spaces. Flatlands are spaces of silence, of absence, but these spaces don't appear uniformly across the entire city. We see such landscapes in poor and Black neighborhoods where the historical practices of racial discrimination and segregation are replaced in the 20th century by more subtle and pernicious forms of environmental injustice. Media accounts add to the devaluation via negative imagery and stories around crime, blight, and neglect. Add to this aesthetic regime of privation that is associated with flatlands. Since 2012, the Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures Field School has focused on Milwaukee's flatlands to explore alternate and grassroots accounts of place and heritage in these neighborhoods. When I began the field school in 2012, my goal was simple. It was to engage my neighbors in order to hear and learn from them. But soon this project became one in which community members, students, scholars, and I heard each other carefully in order to co-create knowledge and history of the world that we share. Our conversation lasted for multiple years and engaged us in civic action. We collected oral histories and documented places that matter to the community. We produced podcasts, exhibits, and archives, created docudramas and dance recitals around everyday life, crafted street furniture, rainwater trellis, sheds, and catalytic installations that gathered local residents, especially young adults. Writing on the power of storytelling, Alice Water remembers reading Zora Neale Hurston with her relatives in Boston and New York. And she said, they sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, a kind of paradise was regained. The Field School project draws upon that transnational genealogy of storytelling and story sharing as a form of practice that allows us to understand our place in this world and make it a better one. So the first story will take you, we'll talk about how do you look at this world, how do you see architecture. This story takes you to on a cold and chilly fall day in 2017, when during a community walk, students, community residents, and I stood in the intersection of Wright and 38th Street, located near the now infamous Sherman Park uprising. Just a year ago, police shot dead 23-year-old Civil Smith blocks away from where we were standing, and the community rose in revolt. Immediately after this event, New York Times wrote, and I quote, "The burning buildings, smashed police cars, and scuffles between police officers and angry protesters on Milwaukee's north side over the weekend might have seemed like a spontaneous eruption, but for many of the city's marginalized Black community, it was an explosive release decades in the making," end quote. As we ponder on the ominous prognosis in the Times article, it is also important to question this assumption that Sherman Park residents stood by as hapless victims of historical injustice, or that they were transformed into alienating rioting mobs. Indeed, during the walk, residents challenged this perspective of this portrayal and argued that they were a community that believed in peace and hope by pointing towards the centerpiece yard signs meant to represent their world as an island of calm and positivity. Yet, despite these yard signs, boarded up foreclosed duplexes, city-owned vacant homes, potholes, empty lots with overgrown grass, broken beer bottles filled our visual field. What the residents told us was not what we saw in front of us. What we saw reiterated culturally produced perceptions of blight. These negative signs were familiar to us because their symbolic meanings are pretty much ingrained in us. After working with this community for 4 years, we learned to read the same scene differently. We were able to see how empty lots were repurposed by residents, how sidewalks and streets doubled up as meeting spaces, and how porches and in-between spaces between buildings became part of a public commons. We found incredible diversity and vibrancy in this neighborhood. We realized that our methods of seeing and describing this landscape or this environment focused on the quality of buildings and infrastructure as the sole measures of well-being. Our ways of seeing was yielding to an epistemological blindness, and this contradiction between what we perceived and the lived reality of this place, between what was visible and what remained invisible to us, was at the core of how inequality and injustice was perpetuated and established in the everyday world of centerpiece. In our early interpretation, buildings were centered on property lots, and the quality of buildings indicated the ability of a homeowner to maintain their property, that is, their financial ability to do so. We saw streets and sidewalks as common property maintained by the city. So broken homes, empty lots, and urban blight seemed to be symbolic of a breakdown of that order, of declension, of poverty, of atrophy. But the community introduced us to a different ecology of space, open spaces, in-between spaces, alleys, and front yard spaces as part of what Silvia Federici calls the urban commons, and what J.T. Rohn describes as a historical communal space within marginalized African-American communities in the US.
Sherry's block in particular is in the middle of an area that's really broken. It had a store in the next block on the corner of Sherry's house. One store had graffiti on the side of the store. One said RIP, and it had someone's name, and then it said free another name. So that meant that one person had died and one person was in jail. It was about 4 or 5 vacant houses with broken windows bust out on the block, about 4 or 5 vacant lots on the block, and a park that hasn't been redeveloped since 1995. And we were just trying to get people to come to community meetings. And we had a very hard time. Neighbors weren't safe. They didn't feel comfortable. But we got together again, all of us banded together, and we started pulling people into community meetings, and we got different block groups. Danielle has a group, Sherry has a group, and Tremero has a group. So some of those groups began to rotate their meetings and build more momentum with getting more neighbors involved in some initiatives. And so the more we became consistent, the more we saw our community groups and our initiatives growing. And so we got neighbors together and they felt comfortable with thinking about spaces to activate to make the neighborhood safer. They got comfortable with having conversations with neighbors about safety and talking with each other and thinking about a plan of what we could do with the area. And so that's how we came about with Unity Orchard and Scholars Park. So we started getting those things going, and we wanted to get a park. And so people were kind of reluctant to do the park, but they wanted to start with the spaces. And the more we grew those parks and the orchards, and the more people started coming, and the more we had community meetings, the more people started opening up. You know, it was 3 homicides on Sherry's block in less than 10 months. And so once we created those spaces, it made neighbors come out a little more. It made them feel comfortable going in a space on the block. It deterred a lot of the negative behaviors. You do always have a small group of people who do still do things, but it really deterred a lot of the things that were going on in Sherry's neighborhood.
Another resident, Tremor Robinson, described a system of open and interstitial spaces as the community commons. Unlike private property lots, these spaces gathered the community around a sense of communal ownership. So for her, for Tremor, the struggle over the control of her neighborhood was the same as the struggle over the control of the commons. Let's dig a little deeper to examine the power and potential of these commons, these in-between spaces. On the corner of the street we were standing on was a peace garden, which is shown here with a white arrow, that local activist Camille Mays had built for the community members to replace a roadside memorial commemorating the death of Arthur and Brenda Ward's child, an innocent girl who was killed by a ricocheting bullet in the middle of a gunfight. Makeshift memorials are common sight in Milwaukee's North Side neighborhoods, where instances of random roadside deaths are routine. Soon after a shooting or a traffic accident, makeshift memorials appear on the scene of the tragedy. These memorials are not permanent. They appear on nebulous territory such as curbsides, median strips, empty untended lots, or roadside corners. And because these are all city-owned, the city sees them as illegal encroachments. So Mays has planted a series of such memorials, and she's planted about 8 gardens between 2014 and today. The size of these gardens vary from 2 feet to 8 feet long, so that the small group of 3 or 5 people can build and maintain these gardens. By encouraging a sense of shared ownership and stewardship around an object of beauty, the Peace Garden Project became a site of political resistance against the city's abject disinvestment and a beacon gathering neighborhood residents and family members as they organize as a community. So these basically memorials were transformed into this little pocket park. Caring for a peace garden affectively engages all residents on the street. It promotes relational bonds between block members, and often, as in this case, collaboration across age groups, young and adults and aged and elderly. Peace gardens become a space of appearance, a point of meeting, persisting, laboring, sharing, and feeling that Judith Butler calls body acts, to refer to the performative potential of human actions in space. The sight of people digging, planting, decorating in order to replace a symbol of death into gardens became acts of protest and solidarity. This was beauty used in the service of hope, hope for collective resistance against violence, injustice, and neglect.
But I think we care because we care. That's why. We care because we really care. And we care about what goes on next door. And next door. And if everybody watch next door and next door, so like, if we can, we move their snow when we move ours. When we water our flowers, we water theirs. When we pick up paper, we pick up this side and that side. We care.
The dilapidated and disinvested optics of this neighborhood may indeed seem to be byproducts of historical injustice, but as Bama Grice just now argued, residents in her block go beyond this optics of hopelessness towards an ethics of caring that describes an emotional relationship between people and place that makes certain buildings and landscapes meaningful. What we learned from our interviews reiterated political scientist Joan Tronto's position that acts of caring offers a major alternative to our current ways of understanding cities, both conceptually and historically. My second story focuses on how we analyze and document our built environment. Here, my argument is that we move beyond an analysis of materials, design, and style, and instead examine layout and morphology of buildings to observe how users modify and adapt built form to suit their ever-changing needs. Meet Waching Zong Cha Lor. Lor is a refugee, a pastor at the Salvation Church of God, a host of ABC Hmong Radio, and a local entrepreneur. He bought 2 city-owned foreclosed mixed-use duplexes in Milwaukee's Washington Park neighborhood in 2013. Located along the now derelict corridor Willett Street, which you've seen before, the same image that is up on top on the top right. Lor's building are among many boarded up mixed-use duplexes in this area. By 2013, the city of Milwaukee had more than 3,000 city-owned vacant buildings that prompted the city to proactively find alternate economically sustainable uses for these spaces. They started the $1 home scheme that allowed city to sell vacant buildings to potential buyers for just $1. Hmong newcomers such as Lor had been buying these boarded up buildings from the city. But city inspectors have fined Lor multiple times for not maintaining his house facade or for zoning violations when he used his house as a church. Planners don't see much historical or cultural value in Cha's boarded up home. Lor's home doesn't find mention in architectural history books or in the preservationist list of things to save. Even the neighbors are not happy. During a neighborhood group meeting in the Washington Drive neighborhood in fall 2015, residents complained to us that the Hmong residents rarely appeared on their porches to socialize with others. Some misconstrued this as this kind of social reticence as a lack of neighborliness. But there was value and beauty here too, and it took us a while to learn to see it. Lor's building was built in 1909 for German-born John L. Reisner, an immigrant who came to Milwaukee from Europe and was employed as a factory worker in the local industry. Manuscript census tells us that in addition to John, his wife, his sister-in-law, and 2 of his nieces lived in the same apartment till 1930s. The building facade, with its pedimented and gabled front, architectural ornamentation, and stylistic details, reflected the upward mobile lifestyle of its working-class homeowners and presented an image of respectability to neighbors. So when Reisner in 1909 moved into this building, he was also indicating his economic and social class success to his neighbors through his building. In this quest to become better off, John needed additional income. This home offered him a way to make that extra money. Milwaukee duplexes, explained Tom Hupka, are 2-storied independent flats stacked on top of one another so that each floor resembles a bungalow plan. The top and bottom units have independent entrances from the street, allowing different uses for the 2 units. Reisner could lease out the lower flat to a store or a business or to a renter and gather rent. Indeed, the value of this building lay in its unique and successful morphology that accommodated a variety of residents and their cultural preferences for over a century. In 1950, new owners converted the attic into a single occupancy unit and the second floor into 2 divided apartments. Then they converted the lower floor to a bakery, jewelry shop, and a variety of other businesses under different owners, and the list is right here. Archival records indicated the presence of tenants, extended families, sometimes boarders in this building. So in other words, the building form offered its users multiple uses and possibilities. And so did the layout. The duplex building had a front, middle, and back zones, which is shown here in both the section and in the panel. The front zone included entrance. This is the front zone. This is the front zone in the plan. It included entrance, living space, and dining area. Decorative woodwork and detailing suggested that this zone served as a formal space of kind of socializing and bringing in guests. The back zone was made up of kitchen, pantry, and back stairs. It had absolutely no architectural adornments. The back of the house was connected via a service staircase. It tied the attic storage to kitchens, basement laundry, mostly used by female residents for domestic labor. So therefore, the house was divided into two zones, the front zone of leisure and the back zone of labor. Today, the front facade or woodwork detailing no longer serves prior cultural, socioeconomic, and political aspirations because these features mean nothing to Lore or to his African American or Asian American neighbors. Architectural moldings, architraves, and sun windows don't have the same relevance to the current residents as it did to the German working class residents of the 20th century. That explains why Lore never fixed his facade. The city inspector fined him, but never really understood why Lore refused to update the facade architectural moldings. However, Lore understood the architectural potential of this building, and he creatively adapted the house form by flipping the front and the back spaces. So now he uses the front rooms of the upper unit where he lives in as private rooms and as offices. So this is the front section, which he's using instead of the living room. He's using it as his office and his private room. The front stair and the front entrance is rarely used. Instead, the kitchen, which is the back, is repurposed into an entry hall. Visitors, family, and friends enter the space and gather around the kitchen table around food and food preparations, around acts of commensality and communal assembly. This reconfiguration of the interior morphology is established by adapting the interior layout, often temporarily, often theatrically, during everyday activities. Lore's home is not unique. Our research on multiple Hmong homes in this neighborhood presented similar, less permanent strategies of architectural reorganization. In majority examples, the residents totally blocked up the front doors. And in this picture up on the up top left, they actually literally put a shoe rack on the front door. They used the front porch as storage space for garden equipments, and they used the backyard as social space. The back stairs, the backyard, and the in-between spaces take on a larger significance for the new residents. And there is a reason for this spatial reversal. Lore's family has very few Hmong friends and relatives living in adjacent buildings. Instead, their world is spread across distances, neighborhoods, cities, even states and nation states, displaying a network spatiality, spatial identity that Wilbur Zielinski calls heterolocalism. So no longer squeezed into ethnic ghettos or exclusionary neighborhoods, Hmong Americans have dispersed across geographical distances in contemporary American cities, and they converge in each other's homes for everyday and special events. So therefore, multiple cultural organizations of space exist in this neighborhood. One that is visible, the traditional 20th century street front society of the original owner, John Reisner, where the porch is a social space. Another one that is less visible, certainly not visible to us, is the new landscape occupied by Char Lore, where the back gathers networked and geographically dispersed kin. Instead of focusing on the material condition and ornamentation, we find that the organization and morphology of the duplex tells us a lot about the cultural potential of these buildings. We discover that spatial layout of the buildings accommodate a diversity of cultures and residents over time, and hence sustains a multicultural society. I offer this as an example to demonstrate how cultural significance for a Hmong American resident doesn't work in the form of appearances. That means ornamentation, style, physical conditions are not important categories. Rather, the organization of architectural space, how human bodies move between front and back entrances, offer the Hmong residents an opportunity to creatively articulate a familiar world in an unfamiliar setting. Acknowledging such sensory and embodied production of space can change how we do fieldwork and how we evaluate worth and value in the built world around us. So these two stories bring me to my conclusions. That the methods we developed at our field school to be able to see differently, and these are the 4 methods that we kind of talk about. The field school's methodology. It involves 4 iterative steps, and it's kind of circular and iterative because we go back and forth between these steps. They are 1, deep listening, 2, place-based conversations, 3, recurring dialogues, and 4, collaborative civic action. Deep listening begins with long interviews with pre-selected residents and then organized storytelling sessions that gather people to talk about their neighborhood history. In addition, quick smartphone-based short interviews during public events or in public spaces allow research team to collect answers to very focused questions about place and heritage. These storytelling sessions encourage community residents to connect with one another, to build local pride, identify places that matter to them, and find common visions for their community. Community partners also identify sites and situations that promote that promote actions against crime, delinquency, and health disparities, and they brainstorm appropriate local solutions to ameliorate these problems. Place-based conversations include community-led walks. These peripatetic events allow residents to tell stories to their community while being present on site. Community members also identify how vacant buildings and unused structures may be repurposed for potential reuse and entrepreneurial ventures unique to their needs. The field school research team then marks these sites on a digital story map that are overlaid with audio clips of residents telling stories explaining why these spaces matter to them. Field workers capture soundscapes, map movement, and document short-lived events and spaces in between buildings to help articulate invisible worlds that may escape our narrow, ocular-centered methods of architectural studies. And this map, geographers call them counter maps because they're maps done from bottom up. It's not the official map that you saw in the beginning. It's map produced by the people of the neighborhood to redefine the neighborhood. And this map has actually become a tourism tool. The neighbors have used it to introduce new people into their neighborhood. And it's also become a map that, a smartphone app that the community uses in order to create community-led walks. After the first round of interviews, walks, and architectural documentation, the university team returns to the community to continue a dialogue, what we call the recurring dialogue, in which community members are invited to share their letters, photographs, objects, and stories to participate in discussions about these items. These objects and stories are digitally captured and shared in a web-based archive that promotes the residents' sense of pride, a sense of place. This growing archive persists as a resource for the community. Collaborative action emerged from these long-term commitments. Dance, theater, architecture, and art students work with community residents to create docudramas, public performances, art, and architectural installations. Here you actually see the Department of Dance students who also are part of the fall studio. And below here, you see what's known as a history harvest, where people bring in photographs and share stories, and we capture those photographs and stories and we put them up on our website. Field school research team also design, make, and disseminate zines. That is, they're handmade magazines and small brochures that summarize ideas gleaned from many rounds of interviews. So what you're seeing here are multiple forms of conversation. They're not just always talk conversation, but they're conversations through action, through performance, through zines and all kinds of other forms. In 2019, the field school team and the community members from the Centerpiece block of Sherman Park neighborhood contributed their story of environmental justice work to the Newark-based Humanities Action Lab national traveling exhibit called Climates of Inequality. The Milwaukee exhibit emerged from a long experience of working with frontline communities, collecting stories of valiant struggles and successes against a long, long history of injustice. Time is an important component of this project. Our university works around class schedules during semesters, while the community partners work day and night shifts. Coordinating the schedule of university and community partners offers a very difficult challenge that can be resolved by planning this engagement on an incremental basis. That is, fieldwork is iterative. It occurs over multiple years. The research team meets in the summer, then goes back again in fall, and so on. This continuous telling and retelling, listening and reacting, documenting and constructing produces catalytic moments of fellowship. So, What happens if we rethink what we value, recover the voices of those who are otherwise rendered marginal, and discover that otherwise invisible world of beauty and human agency? We begin to act differently. Acknowledging the precarity of everyday places and ordinary people challenges established spatial politics. We have learned that architecture is not a neutral or a scientific practice. As young architects, your role in the world is to build a more just and inclusive society, to explore methods that can empower the powerless, give voice to those whose heritage and agency remain unheard, and to render visible that which remains invisible. I'm speaking of a kind of engaged practice where we use local knowledge to empower citizens, to critique claims that architecture is a mode of unchecked development, where marginalized people are further marginalized, to resist land grabbing where land gets appropriated for tourism or in the service of free market. These emancipatory goals require us to see differently, to explore new methods, and to acknowledge alternative aesthetic practices. Indeed, history so written could become catalyst for transformative social change. Perception of beauty could then indeed become a moral test. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. I would like to invite Dr. Binti Singh, Dean of Research at KRVIA, if she'd like to respond to the lecture.
Thank you, Professor. I'm spellbound. I'm speechless. I don't know how to respond. I mean, it's been a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I mean, you have actually captured many, many themes that, well, I'm a humanities student, I'm a sociologist, so I understand the anthropological tradition and the ethnography and the observation. Sometime back, we had Chuck Wolf, who was talking of observation, and he devised this method called learn. So, I find this. I learned a lot today from your presentation. So I will need time to process. I have been taking notes diligently, and so I really want students to think and process all this information. It's been beautiful, and I really think that all your stories, the two stories that you shared, kind of testimony to the fact that beauty is, what did you say? Yes, the perception of beauty is indeed a moral test. So I'm glad that your school is offering these kind of opportunities for students to involve with the community and come up with this, because it really is the need of the hour, and to engage with questions of justice and marginalization and so many important things. And the best thing that I loved is the Humanities Action Lab, because as a student of humanities for the longest time, I was looking for this, and you have actually given it to me. So I'm really grateful to you. Students,
you can,
yes, tell me.
You can join the, your school can join the Humanities Action Lab too. They are an international exhibition. Okay. So right now they had 3 exhibitions. The first one was in Guantanamo. The second one was on incarceration. And the third one was on environmental justice. Right now they're working on COVID. And so they actually encourage various schools to connect and send in stuff. Okay. So yeah, I can send you more details if you're interested.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. We'll definitely keep that in mind, and we will stay connected. And oh, yes, we have Sonal speaking, and we have something from our director. So I'll take them one by one. Sonal, my colleague, she says that thank you for the incredible lecture and the presentation of such lovely work. It's very inspiring, I must tell you, Professor. Very inspiring. So for the deprived, marginalized communities, the histories are a result of systemic deprivation, she writes. How does one deal with the recognition of histories through the lens of just a second, of conservation? Can conservation ever escape the aestheticization of poverty and precarity when it builds identities based on these histories? That is her question to you. That is Sonal.
Hi, Sonal. Thank you for your question. It's actually a question that is very close to my heart because as a historic preservation person also, we have been struggling with this for some time. And so there are intangible heritage, other ways of doing things, but I have realized one thing, that our methods of doing preservation, which includes the methods of documentation, as well as the methods of kind of identifying what value is or integrity is what the word is here, is problematic because they have been based on a certain history of, mostly white and mostly men who have defined what is valued, what is valuable. And in this country, for the last few years, with the destruction of the monuments, the bringing down of old, white racist monuments, that kind of discussion has become very powerful. Now, can it ever, the aestheticization of poverty and the precarity, which is based on these identities? No, it's harder to get rid of it. However, what we do in Milwaukee is that we follow an anthropological tradition called collaborative ethnography, in which the writing of the writing process is also done by the people who are our collaborators. Now, that's a very difficult one because it takes too long. It's easier to go to a neighborhood, do the research, and come back and write it up ourselves. But in order for them to do this, this is why this iterative different forms of conversation happens here. And what has happened in my personal experience is it has changed my knowledge. I had to unlearn a lot of things I'd learned in architecture school and rethink and relook at the world. And so it is possible, but it takes a way longer time. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I was just thinking because, like, I remember I had read Sell Out, the novel, and that kind of very poignant, dark humor condition of how one when one's history and one's being is othered, what is the identity you can make through that history is dealt with in this very dark, kind of humanist narrative. So, and I think in our context, the way the slum is looked at, it has many of this kind of problematic gaze that, how do you valorize practices? How do you talk about histories and fabrics that have emerged from extreme deprivation? I think, of course, these two histories are very different and the conditions are very different. And perhaps the politics as well are very different. Yeah. But I was just thinking parallelly. Yeah. Thank you so much. What a fabulous presentation. I can't hear.
Thank you. No, what worked in my favor was that because I'm South Asian, I'm Indian, and I didn't grow up in this country, I was completely unfamiliar to the African-American landscape. So I went in there ignorant. That helped a lot because if I had gone there with knowledge, then that knowledge would have already framed the other in a particular way. I didn't have I knew a little bit, but I didn't know how to frame the other. So then I let the other teach me how to see them then. And that is a harder task, but it is easier for an outsider to do. So for instance, if I were in India and I was looking at marginalization in India, it would be way harder for me when I'm an entitled, upper caste man to be able to see the difference. So sometimes it's easier for us, for when you are an outsider, to see another way of framing this issue.
Thank you for that amazingly lovely presentation. It was so good to see the work. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Sen, we have our director Manoj Parmar, who has written in the chat box. First of all, very well crafted theoretical position, seeking architecture, heritage, people, and the question of beauty as larger value system exploring alternative history. So he writes, what is Syndromous object? That is his question to you.
Yeah, it was from a dance sequence that, by the way, thank you for your question, Dr. Parmar, Professor Parmar. And it's nice that you're here. So yeah, that synchronous objects was a dance that was produced in Ohio State University by a person whose name I'm forgetting, but I can send it to you. He basically looked at this relationship. The dance was an impromptu site-specific engagement where he looked at the relationship, entangled relationship between people, objects, and the larger space. And that whole dance, which basically is how we also navigate, in his argument, navigate a sidewalk. We dance because we know how much distance we need to keep from the other person next to us. So that's the contrapuntal movement he's talking about. And so this particular dance series was between the dancers, the tables they were jumping on, and the space in itself, and the space changes. And he analyzes it, and then he documents it digitally. And he recreates what the process is, because the process on the one hand is embodied, there is a particular rationale to it, but it also changes with context. So it's emergent, it's not there, it emerges in that particular moment when the object and the person comes together. So it was a different form of dance where the dance was not pre-done or was not pre-choreographed, but the choreography was that momentary performance. That's where synchronous object as the dance process came. So they have a website, which funnily that website was, I captured it before it went down. They got rid of JavaScript. So now all these old websites with JavaScripts are all gone. So yeah.
I was curious because myself and Dr. Binti Singh has written a paper published in international journal known as Synchromesh Urbanism, and how this word just occurred to me. Occurred to us somewhere, without referring to anything. So I was curious. It's also actually looking at how all this events in the city gets synchronized suddenly, creates a one seamless experience. Anyway, it was wonderful presentation. I will ask Vidhi to check if there are more questions to address.
I also put in the websites of our field school, and the last one is very exciting. So this year, I am actually co-directing a statewide project where we're bringing this to the state. So we have 4 young people and libraries working in 4 different small towns in Wisconsin. That's very exciting.
Yes, of course, your body of work is very exciting. I learned a lot, rhetorical localisms, and I have been taking notes and lots of things, collaborative civic action. So I was just thinking now, whatever the stories that you talked about, in the context of the global south, if we take Mumbai as a case, these less permanent strategies of reorganizing space, it is something that we see on an everyday basis. You just drive across and you will see that. So Mumbai is a great laboratory, So I was thinking that if we could kind of test your methods in this part of the world, and it would be a great collaborative research kind of
It'll be
yes. endeavor for both of us.
But where do you think I learned it from? I learned it from my past. That way of seeing is a cultural way of seeing, Yes. So it's not new in India. It's always there. I think what happens as architects, we are trained to look at the permanent and we begin to not see it. But actually our everyday life in India has to deal with this every day on a sidewalk as you're walking down the street. So yeah, that's where actually I got this vision, my cultural ability to do this.
From Kolkata. I am from Kolkata, so I'm very curious to ask you. I'm from Presidency College in Kolkata, so I grew up in Kolkata. So I was a little curious to ask you, where in Kolkata did you grow up?
I actually grew up very less in Kolkata. I went to Bombay, and I lived in Bombay for the longest time, and I was in Gujarat before that, in a place called Bhavnagar. And so, and then I worked in Delhi. So I've been all over the place. But when I was in Kolkata, I lived in a place called Baliganj, Circular Road. Yeah. But in Mumbai, I actually graduated from JJ. So not too far away from you.
Okay, there is Rohan in front of us, and I introduce him to you. He is the dean of our bachelor's program. And over to you, Rohan. Please feel free
Thanks, Mindy, and thank you, Arijit, for that really thought-provoking and really also very beautifully structured presentation. Actually, I really loved the entire kind of aesthetic and the crafting of the presentation as well. So that is actually what brings me to my sort of inquiry: the question of craft. As architects, especially, I'm looking at kind of acts of making and thinking about how do we train professionals in acts of making. And when one is dealing with these sorts of community-based sort of projects, I was actually wondering about the question of what happens around this course. What are the questions of form making, structure, etc.? How does one think about that? Don't all of those presumptions also get completely challenged and re-articulated because of the worldview, I guess, that a studio like this provides? So I was actually wondering what that is. There a tension between that? And what kind of relationship exists?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Shiv Kumar. Yeah, that tension always exists. That's the life of this project. So so in the summer, when I do the field school, which is basically oral history and documenting physical landscapes, I stop students from trying to resolve anything, because one of the issues of our architectural profession is we always try to look for a problem to resolve it. The design project becomes a resolution of a problem or a hypothesis. And what the problem with that is too much quickly thinking about that leads to incomplete responses, in incomplete ways. So we don't think about that. But then in fall, we get a studio in there, and it's an architecture studio and a dance studio and an art studio independently working together. So the issue of craft becomes very interesting. For the first thing that happens is the three different performances, three different art practices, architecture, dance, and art. They are very different. Architecture students do not like dancers, even though they should like. That's because the dancers, just watching dancers make you open up. So already they have a tension in the craft that all three groups use in order to make their voices, have their conversations in their language, if you may. The second thing we do is we have to struggle against a certain aesthetics of studios, which, I have to say, I myself find it very difficult as a teacher, because I also want my students to do drawings which looks like everyone else's studio. But those drawings, not only do they take up time, but they also don't express. In other words, let me put it simply, those drawings are not completely accessible to the people we are studying or working with. So if we take those drawings to the community, they're just going to say, oh, that's very beautiful, and that's it. So we have to figure out another way of communicating architectural form with the people. So things we would do bit of parts, which is easier for people. We'll actually make little models and take it, which can be built on site. And then we have, in part of public interest design, we build a catalytic object. So when you saw, they were building these seats and planters. They were and that's what the community wanted. They wanted planters. But the whole idea of building that, the aesthetics of building, was an external outdoor green living room, which we realized that's what they wanted. But we also, historically, we found out that the outdoor green living room is a cultural memory of Black African Americans from the time of slavery. So there was a historical part to it. How do you build that outdoor green living room? That became a design challenge. And I think my students did fail in some respect. They failed in how they put those things together. That is, they failed in the organization of the individual objects. They did the individual objects very well. So we begin to realize the scalar issue of like the object itself and the organization of the object, and then the street in itself. So that becomes the third problem of craft, that because of the scalar issues. So, it's become a very complicated studio. And since the last 6 or 7 years I've been doing it, all I've been trying to do is simplify it as much as I can. Right now, as it stands, we do still make an object, a smaller, intimate object, but then it falls within the facade of the street. So we understand the street as a kind of an assemblage in which the object sits, and then we have to communicate that to the people. So that's really the problem, huge tension that we go through every year, and that doesn't resolve itself.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up, I think what a kind of project like this does, I think it really expands the idea of what the craft of an architect is, where
Yes.
the body of the architect is also part of the performance of architecture,
Yes.
in the way that she would then conduct herself or within communities, the way that one designs events around it, so temporality.
Yes.
And when especially when you were talking about dancers,
Yes.
and the fact that it becomes actually a way in which the performance of architecture happens way beyond that of the drawing as an entity. And I think I was and as architects, we are not necessarily trained in the body or performance in some sense. It's always imagined as architecture exists as this completed artifact that is then used. And that really is kind of interesting for us to start thinking about how do we design our studios themselves such that performativity within the world is also something that one is learning within the studio space. Just something for me to start thinking about, actually.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll introduce you to Ainsley Lewis. He is the Dean of the Master's Program at KRVIA. Ainsley, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Arijit. I think that was a fantastic lecture, and I'm so glad we pushed all our master's students to kind of participate in this. One of the things I thought when Rohan was coming on, he was actually going to talk about the studio, which we actually do at the master's level. Actually, he's in charge of the studio. It's a first-year studio, which actually talks about these understandings of the ways of seeing and representation. And it's a complex way, and you've very well articulated it in your lecture. But one question I have for you is that very often when we compile all this information and data, one needs to cull the information and edit the information which has to be represented, and automatically the culling and editing of the information which is represented back to the community or to the new observer is based on one's own history and past and one's position. So how does one overcome that? I mean, we are facing this in our studio itself, where we're always telling them, okay, what more are you looking at this, etc., etc. So are there any ideas, and how do you overcome this in your own studios?
So, couple of answers to that. First of all, thanks for coming. It's early in the morning, but thank you very much. A couple of answers to that. The first one is because I'm also a public historian and I bring it through oral history. One of the things I tell my students is to acknowledge the fact that what we are producing is not an authentic representation of someone out there, another. It's actually an authentic representation of our relationship with the other. So we are not trying to literally try to be as objective as possible to have that other person's point of view correctly, because we frankly can't ever be correct. But what we can be correct about is the acknowledgement that the relationship that that person has with you and the place where you meet, all those three parts, the you, the other, and the place and the location, is what this story is about. So the student has to insert himself or herself into this narrative. The way we do it, and it's been very successful, I wasn't convinced about its success, but I started doing that, and it was is to really do reflections. They have a reflective journal, which is fine, but they actually have to talk about how they are how this engagement implicates them in the politics. I'll give you an example. There was a white girl who was very young. She had come in as an undergraduate, the first year undergraduate. She'd first come in and started working on this. She came from a very small town of like 500 people or something like that. They've never seen Black people in their lives. She came in. Her father was very worried that she's in a neighborhood like this. Her father kept telling her, buy a spray, pepper spray, this, that. So finally, one day she said, Daddy, let me take you to the place I work. And she took her father into that neighborhood. And the father realized that there were just other people just like him, lives in houses just like him. And that whole, the idea of the otherness was something that he's constructed. So Bella actually went back and started working on her research project and her design project, where the project that she did was her relationship with the people who built it and how it was historical. What she was part of a longer history of black and white separation in this country. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of addressing this kind of impossibility, if you may, of really separating yourself from the object of your analysis, if you may, is having multiple forms of conversations and products. So this iterative thing, actually, this was not planned. I learned it as I went. But in addition to architectural drawings, there are these zines. We also make podcasts. We have dancers doing dance. So we have so many forms of media in which this production of stories are disseminated back to the community. And this multiplicity actually allows the differences to flourish. So somehow media multiplicity helps. Yeah, that's the only two way. But I have found my students acknowledge the fact that they are not independent or separated spectators.
Thank you. Thanks, you.
I was just intrigued to ask you, this kind of inspires from the phenomenological school of thought which Husserl was talking of. He talked about bracketing. So it's a very difficult position that we take. I mean, how do we actually do that? And your methods, a little bit about methods, deep listening, place-based conversations, recurring dialogues, and collaborative civic action, which is the fallout of the first two. First three, yeah. So can you just elaborate a little bit about what is the difference between listening and deep listening?
Yeah, so that was that is probably the most important lesson from these 10 years that we have been doing this. So deep listening is not just simply listening to someone's voice. That is, you sit in front of me and you talk and I listen. Deep listening requires us to listen to us, understanding and reflecting on the relationship between the speaker, the interviewee, and the interviewer. And it's also the fact that you listen to what's Michael Frisch calls shared authority, that the authority of the scholar is now shared with the person you're working with, so that whoever you're talking to, direct a certain history telling or certain telling. They tell you the story. So it has to be open-ended. It can't be, the social science mode of actually having a structured questionnaire. And how you actually have the open, it's also not open-ended enough to be just like whatever, you talk with whatever. So you have to figure out the structure. So that's the first step towards deep listening. The second one is to think of various forms of listening. So usually it's not very normal for human beings to sit down in front of each other for 1 hour with a microphone and talk. People talk on the go. So that's where our walking and talking and the smartphone-based talking. So there are various forms of listening that we have to develop in addition to simply just asking questions and listening, which goes into participatory observation. So we actually participate to listen. Then we have to also look at other forms of listening, which includes listening to buildings, which actually everyone here will understand. But when I tell my historians, they're like, what? You talk to buildings? But buildings do talk to us. And buildings tell us those things that human beings do not tell us because it's so obvious to them that they don't think of mentioning it. So we actually literally have a very intimate conversation with the building because I insist on them measuring with their hand, using a flashlight to actually see changes in the building structure. So literally see the building as something that grew up and transformed over time as a result of human values. So that's why we call it deep listening, because it's not just a single form of listening, it's multiple forms of listening over a long period of time, and then sending back the zines and listening to them again. So that's the whole concept. It's iterative.
Thank you for that explanation. Okay, we have Meenal, our faculty member. She writes, Meenal, you can switch on your camera. Yeah. She says, thanks for this lovely presentation, community participation is an answer to a lot of urban processes. What I am really curious about is the community's initial response to your project. Were they responsive or they reacted differently, and the process to convert them was something that really led to this way of mapping? So 3 questions.
That's a really good question, Mino, and thank you very much for asking that. Yes, of course they didn't accept me, because there's a history of our universities going into marginalized communities and sucking them like bloodsuckers, finding out data and then leaving. So yes, there was a complete distrust, but there are a couple of things, as I was saying, which worked in my favor. I was an outsider. I had a different accent. I'm from a different place. I was just this exotic outsider who was clueless and was there. And frankly, I was there for a very personal reason. I was there because this was a community which was like the community I left in India. It was a community which hangs out in the, in the porches and have conversations. There's always an uncle who's very philosophical. There's a matriarch who everyone listens to. That's the kind of, so I went there to kind of find a place. So they recognized that. So I remember the first time I walked into an artist's office and he said, "Oh no, you're yet another one of those university scholars who are intellectual carpetbaggers." I didn't know what the word carpetbaggers meant. And I said, you just have to see. The key here was that I was not doing it for my research. Actually, my research is on South Asian immigration and immigrant spaces. I was doing this because of my personal reason of knowing the world I actually live in, to understand what marginality means. Also because I'm aware, super aware, that if I were to be in India, I would never have seen marginal because I was the majority. So what happened is I went there over and over every year. So it was very frustrating. I have to say, people wouldn't turn up for our events. But the only thing is, because after 2 years of seeing me come over and over again through the entire year, then I suddenly became familiar. So that's one way where I actually kind of got away from the community's initial reaction of like, you're an outsider, we don't want you. The second thing was actually building. So the first time we were very successful was when some of my students decided that they're going to build a shed in a place where there used to be a farmer's market, but the farmer's market will break every time there was a rain. So they said we needed some rain shelter. But then there was no, so the university won't let us build sheds because they are permanent structures, and the lawyers wouldn't let us do permanent structures. So what we did is we built a shed with the foundation was buckets with concrete in it. And so the shed was not very steady, And so what happened is when we left, it would shake in the breeze. And it became part of their folklore where everybody would come out to see the UWM shed, whether it's blown away finally or not. And that unintentionally, we got into the folklore of the community. And we got accepted because we were the weird people who built a shed which used to shake in the breeze. They actually fundraised and they secured the shed, and now they have events out there, which is again the power of construction, of doing something rather than just talking.
Thank you so much. That was a really nice presentation. Thanks for your answer.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and it is so, all your experiences from this part of the world and how you are actually articulating and getting them in the knowledge domain. It's wonderful.
I'm not sure what happened.
I think she might have mistakenly logged out.
Yes.
I in the meantime, I thought I'll just jump in. Sorry, Binti, I just jumped in.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So it was quite an interesting thing. And for me, one thing that I've been struggling both as a student and now as a faculty, I mean, though you keep developing ideas, the whole fact is that the urban is always an experience, and to really convert that urban as an experience into a tool of mapping and thus building some kind of ideas of manifestations that will then be actually be true to the imagination or the aspirations of the community. It's such a difficult thing, there you can't sow the seeds of that experience so easily and simply. One, it is time bound, and within that time, things change, people change, generations move. This is also my experience working with Dharavi for some time, and also my interest within the idea of the public, where I find it so difficult to, as a practitioner, as a teacher, to what are the tools or what will be the method in order to make even a student realize and understand that whatever actions that we are about to conduct, how that affects urban experience, and that urban experience is something that is lasting, and that is what one really enjoys, or one really what matters, because that is what then really what matters is, because I remember this discussion. I think Paul, Rohan, and I think we guys were talking to Charles Courier when he was here, and he was saying that the psyche of the individual gets developed because of the spaces that he or she lives in. So it's so important, such a big responsibility for us to create those experiences. So so what is your take? Like, what will be the method? I mean, I know it's not an easy thing. It's not like a solution or one, like a pill you drop in and say, hey, you got the method right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a very difficult question. I don't know a method for urban experience, but there are two things I want to say. One is what Abdulmalik Simon, who has been looking at the global south, cities of the global south, talks about, and that is of the city yet to come. That is an urban experience, on the one hand, is out there, and you can measure it, you can document it, and it changes and so on. But there's another one that is emergent, and it happens through fortuity, for serendipity of people coming together. That's what urban experience is. And so therefore it's impossible to capture it. But Abdulmalik Simon has a few ways of not capturing it, but being able to see it. How do you see something that is not emerged yet, but is possible? There's a possibility. So he uses, for instance, the word affordance. How does a space afford things? So I think that's one way of doing that, looking at urban experience. The other one has to do with, I've been thinking, is time, as you mentioned. So there is the intimate time of what happens when I meet you suddenly and then I create space. But there's architectural, historical time. But there's also another time, which is the environmental time. Because even the topography of our land is it's time immemorial, just kind of expressing itself in this moment. So the way I have told my students to make sense of this impossible project is to think of temporality as a way of thinking of urban experience. So there's the environmental time, historical time, monumental time, intimate time, and then there is this time that has not happened yet, but will emerge shortly. But I don't think it still captures urban experience. I don't know if you can.
I know. Yeah, I was thinking, should I? Yeah, it's such a difficult thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's always in the making.
Professor, we are running short of time, and I'm afraid this conversation will carry it forward definitely in future, and we'll be in touch, and look forward to more collaborative civic action and academic knowledge production. Over to you, Mamta. Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for the overwhelming response. I think, has he frozen for you, or is it only for me?
It's only for you.
You'll just wait a minute till he gets back then.
I'm here.
Yeah, you're back. Okay. Yes, so thank you, especially because now I think it's really late into the night for you. But it's really been a pleasure having you contribute to our Encounter Lecture series. So thank you very much. I hope to see you in person the next time you're here.
The pleasure is completely mine. Just to be able to talk to Kamala Raheja and their student is just an incredible opportunity. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.